Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, The Rise, Reign, and Ruin of a Revolutionary Nightmare, Part 1, The Early Life and Origins of Saloth Sar. The man who would become known to the world as Pol Pot, a name synonymous with one of the most horrifying chapters of modern history, was born as Saloth Sar in the small, remote village of Prek Spauv, nestled in the northeastern reaches of Cambodia. This seemingly unremarkable location, far from the political centers of the country, would bear witness to the birth of a figure whose actions would reverberate across the globe. Yet even the basic details of his origins are clouded by historical ambiguity. Official records, themselves scarce and often inconsistent in rural Cambodia during the early 20th century, place his birth date as May 25, 1928. However, alternative accounts suggest that he may have been born 3 years earlier, on May 19, 1925. These discrepancies are a reminder of the opacity that often surrounds the lives of individuals who rise from obscurity to infamy. The question of Saloth Sar's birth year is not merely an academic exercise, it holds implications for understanding his early education and formative years. If he was born in 1928, as many scholars now believe, it aligns with the timeline of his initial schooling, which began at an age appropriate for that birth date. Conversely, a 1925 birth date would suggest an unusual delay in starting his education, an anomaly for a child born into a relatively privileged family like his. This issue highlights the broader challenges of reconstructing the life of a man who, even in later years, was shrouded in secrecy. Saloth Sar was the 8th of 9 children born to Sok Nem and Saloth Fem, a couple whose socio-economic standing set them apart from their peers in Prek Spauv. Sok Nem, his mother, was a devout and pious Buddhist whose religious practices and values deeply influenced her household. Her unwavering faith and adherence to Buddhist traditions created a spiritual environment that would shape the young Salotha's worldview, even as he later rejected organized religion in favor of revolutionary ideologies. Sok Nem's role as a nurturing yet morally disciplined mother provided a foundation of stability and cultural grounding during Salotha's early years. His father, Saloth Fem, was a farmer of considerable means by the standards of rural Cambodia. The family owned over 20 acres of fertile rice paddies, a small but significant herd of cattle, and other resources that elevated them to the upper middle class of their community. Fem's ancestry was of mixed Khmer and Chinese descent, a heritage that subtly influenced Saloth Sar's identity. This level of affluence was unusual in Prek Spauv, a fishing village that lay along the banks of the Seine River. Life in the village was characterized by its simplicity and isolation. The rhythm of daily life revolved around agricultural labor, fishing, and adherence to Buddhist customs. Most of the villagers eked out a subsistence living, their fortunes dictated by the unpredictable cycles of nature. In this context, the Sar family's prosperity marked them as figures of local prominence. The relative privilege enjoyed by the Sar family afforded Saloth opportunities that were inaccessible to the vast majority of Cambodians at the time. This privilege would later become a striking contradiction in his life. How could a man born into comfort and opportunity come to embody an ideology that claimed to champion the impoverished masses? This paradox underscores the complexity of his character and the influences that shaped him. Saloth Sar's upbringing provided him with access to education and social connections that would pave the way for his future endeavors, yet it also insulated him from the hardships experienced by the rural poor whom he would later claim to represent. Prek Spauv itself, while seemingly unimportant in the grand sweep of history, serves as a microcosm of the Cambodia into which Saloth Sar was born. The village was deeply rooted in tradition, its inhabitants bound together by shared cultural and religious practices. Buddhism was not merely a spiritual framework, it was the cornerstone of social order and community identity. Monasteries served as centers of learning and moral instruction, shaping the values of generations. Yet, like much of Cambodia, Prek Spauv was also a place where the ancient and the modern coexisted uneasily. The colonial presence of France, which had established a protectorate over Cambodia in the mid-19th century, was a distant but growing force. French influence permeated the upper echelons of Cambodian society, introducing Western educational models, governance structures, and economic practices. These changes would gradually reshape the country, setting the stage for the upheavals that lay ahead. In 1934, when Saloth Sar was approximately 6 years old, his family made a significant decision that would alter the trajectory of his life. Recognizing the importance of education as a pathway to social mobility and prestige, they sent him to Phnom Penh, Cambodia's bustling capital, to begin his formal schooling. Yet it was also a testament to the family's aspirations for their son, whom they hoped would rise above the limitations of village life. In Phnom Penh, Saloth Sar was enrolled as a novice monk at Wat Botam Vade, one of the city's prominent Buddhist monasteries. This marked the beginning of his exposure to the world beyond Preks Bauv. The monastery, a serene and disciplined institution, provided him with a structured environment in which to study Buddhist teachings, literature, and traditional Cambodian culture. The monastic lifestyle demanded discipline, self-restraint, and adherence to a strict moral code, qualities that would later become defining aspects of his own leadership style, albeit twisted into a dark and oppressive form. While the spiritual teachings of Buddhism left an indelible mark on Saloth Sar, his time at the monastery was significant for another reason. It introduced him to the concept of authority as something both revered and absolute. The hierarchy of monastic life, where novices submitted to the guidance of senior monks, mirrored the hierarchical structures of Cambodian society at large. This early exposure to rigid authority may have planted the seeds for his later belief in centralized control and unyielding discipline. After spending a year at Wat Botam Vade, Saloth Sar transitioned in 1935 to a Roman Catholic primary school in Phnom Penh. This move reflected the colonial dynamics of the time. The school was part of a broader French effort to educate the children of Cambodia's elite, fostering loyalty to the colonial administration. For Saloth Sar, it was an entirely new environment. Here, he mingled with the children of French colonial officials and Cambodian aristocrats, experiencing firsthand the cultural and social divide between the colonizers and the colonized. The curriculum emphasized Western ideals, including French language and literature, history, and the principles of European civilization. Yet, for all its emphasis on academic rigor, Saloth Sar's performance was lackluster. He showed little interest in his studies, often prioritizing sports and recreational activities over classroom learning. Despite his academic struggles, Saloth Sar's family connections ensured that his educational journey continued uninterrupted. In 1942, he was admitted to a prestigious new boarding school in Phnom Penh, an institution closely associated with the Cambodian monarchy. This school was designed to nurture future leaders, offering a curriculum that blended traditional Cambodian values with modern Western education. Saloth Sar's time here coincided with a period of profound political and social change in Cambodia. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 had destabilized the colonial order, weakening France's grip on its overseas territories. In Southeast Asia, the Japanese Empire began expanding its influence, posing a direct challenge to European colonial powers. As Saloth Sar navigated the social and academic life of the boarding school, the world around him was in turmoil. Cambodia, a French protectorate since 1867, found itself caught in the crosscurrents of global conflict. In 1940, the neighboring kingdom of Thailand invaded Cambodia, seizing several provinces with the tacit approval of Japan. A year later, King Monavong, Cambodia's reigning monarch and a figurehead under French control, passed away. His successor, King Norodom Sihanouk, was handpicked by the French as a pliable young ruler who would safeguard their interests. Yet, Sihanouk would later prove to be anything but a passive figure, becoming a central player in Cambodia's tumultuous politics over the next several decades. Part 2. the transition from education to political awakening, as Saloth Sar's formal education continued in Phnom Penh during the early 1940s, Cambodia's political landscape began to shift dramatically. The global conflict of the Second World War was no longer a distant phenomenon, its effects rippled across Southeast Asia, disrupting colonial hierarchies and stirring nationalist sentiments. These formative years marked the beginning of Saloth Sar's exposure to the complexities of power, politics, and colonial dynamics, forces that would profoundly influence his later transformation into the revolutionary leader known as Pol Pot. The impact of French colonial rule and Japanese occupation. By the time Saloth Sar was a teenager, Cambodia had been a French protectorate for nearly a century. Established in 1867, the protectorate had ostensibly preserved Cambodia's monarchy and traditions, but in practice, it subordinated the kingdom to the interests of France. French administrators implemented significant reforms, including the development of infrastructure, the introduction of a Western-style education system, and the expansion of agriculture for export markets. However, these changes often prioritized French economic interests over the well-being of the Cambodian people, deepening socio-economic disparities. Despite the hardships endured by the rural majority, French rule also brought relative stability. By the early 20th century, Cambodia's population had more than quadrupled, from under 1 million in the 1860s to over 4 million by the mid-20th century. Improved agricultural techniques and the reduction of internal conflicts contributed to this growth. However, this veneer of stability masked underlying tensions. The French administration's policies exacerbated the divide between the urban elite, who benefited from colonial rule, and the rural poor, who remained mired in poverty. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 upended this fragile equilibrium. As France fell to Nazi Germany in 1940, its colonial possessions became vulnerable. In Southeast Asia, Japan exploited this weakness, expanding its influence under the guise of liberating Asian nations from Western imperialism. In Cambodia, this period of geopolitical turbulence began with the 1940 Thai invasion, which saw parts of the kingdom ceded to Thailand. This loss of territory, sanctioned by the Japanese, was a blow to Cambodia's national pride and a stark reminder of its vulnerability. By 1941, the death of King Monavong brought further upheaval. The French colonial administration bypassed his designated successor, Prince Monireth, in favor of the young and inexperienced Norodom Sihanouk. At just 18 years old, Sihanouk was seen by the French as a pliable figure who would safeguard their interests. However, the political dynamic soon took an unexpected turn. As Japan occupied Cambodia in 1941, Sihanouk faced the daunting challenge of navigating between Japanese demands and Cambodian nationalist aspirations. Saloth Sar's boarding school years. While these dramatic events unfolded, Saloth Sar was immersed in his studies at a prestigious boarding school in Phnom Penh. This institution, patronized by the Cambodian monarchy, was designed to groom the next generation of leaders. It attracted students from elite families, including members of the royal court, high-ranking government officials, and affluent landowners. For Saloth Sar, whose family's wealth and connection secured his place at the school, this was an opportunity to gain social and intellectual capital that might have otherwise been out of reach. Despite the privilege associated with his education, Saloth Sar continued to struggle academically. His lack of interest in traditional subjects, coupled with his preference for sports like football and basketball, set him apart from his more studious peers. Yet, his time at the boarding school was not without significance. He was exposed to Western ideas, colonial hierarchies, and the burgeoning nationalist movements that were beginning to take root among Cambodia's intellectual elite. These experiences laid the groundwork for the political awakening that would later define his life. The school also served as a microcosm of Cambodia's colonial society, where the cultural and social divide between the French and the Cambodians was palpable. While French teachers and administrators held positions of authority, Cambodian students were often reminded of their subjugated status. This environment fostered a sense of resentment and injustice among some students, particularly those who aspired to positions of influence but found their ambitions constrained by colonial policies. Cambodia under Japanese occupation. As Saloth Sar approached adulthood, the Second World War reached its climax. In 1945, Japan, facing defeat in the Pacific, sought to solidify its influence in Southeast Asia by promoting nationalist movements. In Cambodia, this culminated in King Sihanouk's proclamation of an independent kingdom of Kampuchea in March 1945. While this declaration was short-lived, French colonial rule was reimposed later that year. It planted the seeds of a broader struggle for independence. For young Cambodians like Saloth Sar, these events were profoundly impactful. The brief experiment with independence revealed both the possibilities and limitations of resistance against colonial powers. It also highlighted the role of external forces in shaping Cambodia's destiny, a theme that would recur throughout the nation's modern history. Saloth Sar's transition to vocational training. By the end of the 1940s, Saloth Sar's educational journey took an unexpected turn. Having failed to excel in his studies, he left the boarding school without completing his baccalaureate, the equivalent of a high school diploma. This setback might have derailed the ambitions of someone from a less privileged background. However, Saloth Sar's family connections once again intervened. In 1948, he enrolled in a carpentry course at a technical college in Phnom Penh, a decision that marked a significant departure from the academic trajectory expected of someone with his social standing. At the time, carpentry and other vocational training were seen as pathways for individuals from modest backgrounds to secure stable employment. For Saloth Sar, whose family was among the local elite, this choice was perceived as a step down. Yet, it also reflected the limited opportunities available to someone with a mediocre academic record. This period of vocational training exposed him to a different social milieu, one that included working-class Cambodians whose experiences contrasted sharply with his own. The broader context of post-war Cambodia. As Saloth Sar navigated this transitional phase, Cambodia itself was undergoing a profound transformation. The end of World War II had ushered in a new era of decolonization across Asia and Africa. In Cambodia, King Sihanouk began negotiating greater autonomy from France, leading to the country's first elections in 1946 and the adoption of a modern constitution in 1947. While these developments represented significant progress, they also exposed deep divisions within Cambodian society. Competing political factions emerged, each with its own vision for the country's future. Some sought to preserve the monarchy as a symbol of national unity, while others called for its abolition, viewing it as complicit in colonial exploitation. Amid this volatile political climate, Cambodian students and intellectuals began to play a prominent role in advocating for independence. It was against this backdrop that Saloth Sar's political consciousness began to take shape. Part 3, The Paris Years and the Dawn of Revolutionary Ideals. As the 1940s drew to a close, Saloth Sar's life took another dramatic turn. Despite his lackluster academic performance and unconventional path through vocational training, his family's connections once again facilitated an extraordinary opportunity. In 1949, Saloth Sar was awarded a prestigious scholarship to study in Paris, France. This marked the beginning of a transformative chapter in his life, one that would take him far from the rice paddies and villages of Cambodia to the intellectual and political heart of post-war Europe. A Cambodian in Paris, the decision to send Cambodian students to France was part of a broader colonial policy aimed at cultivating loyalty among the elites of French Indochina. By exposing young men like Saloth Sar to French education, language, and culture, the colonial administration hoped to mold a generation of leaders who would view French rule as benevolent and indispensable. For Saloth Sar, however, the experience had the opposite effect. Rather than becoming an advocate for colonialism, his time in Paris radicalized him and laid the foundation for his later revolutionary ideology. When Saloth Sar arrived in Paris in 1949, he was one of a small but growing number of Cambodian students seeking higher education in the French capital. These students, many of whom came from privileged backgrounds, were grappling with questions of identity, independence, and modernization. For Saloth Sar, Paris represented an entirely new world. The bustling streets, grand architecture, and intellectual vibrancy of the city were a stark contrast to the simplicity of life in Prexbauv or even Phnom Penh. He enrolled at the École Française d'Électronique et d'Informatique (EFEI), where he was supposed to study advanced engineering. However, as in his earlier academic endeavors, Saloth Sar's performance was mediocre at best. He struggled to keep up with the rigorous coursework, and by most accounts, he showed little interest in his studies. Instead, he devoted his energy to political activities and intellectual exploration. The rise of political consciousness, the late 1940s and early 1950s were a time of immense political ferment in France. The aftermath of World War II had brought significant changes to the country's political landscape. The French Communist Party, Parti Communiste Français, or PCF, was at the height of its influence, and debates over colonialism, socialism, and the future of the French Empire were raging. For colonial students like Saloth Sar, these debates were not abstract, they touched on the very essence of their country's struggles for self-determination. Saloth Sar became deeply involved with the Khmer Student Association, a group that served as a hub for Cambodian students in Paris. The association provided a sense of community and connection for students far from home, but it was also a breeding ground for political activism. Many of its members were committed to achieving Cambodian independence from French rule, and the group frequently engaged in discussions about nationalism, colonialism, and social justice. It was within this milieu that Saloth Sar encountered Marxist-Leninist ideology. The Khmer Student Association had links to the more radical Circle Marxist, or Marxist Circle, a clandestine group that studied the works of Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, and other revolutionary thinkers. These texts, with their emphasis on class struggle, anti-imperialism, and the overthrow of oppressive systems, resonated deeply with many colonial students. For Saloth Sar, they provided a framework for understanding Cambodia's situation and a blueprint for action. The limitations of Marxist understanding, despite his growing involvement in Marxist circles, Saloth Sar's grasp of Marxist theory was superficial. In later years, he would admit that he found Marx's writings difficult to comprehend. What drew him to the ideology was not its intellectual rigor but its emphasis on revolution and its potential as a tool for liberation. Saloth Sar was less interested in the nuances of dialectical materialism than in the practical application of revolutionary strategies to achieve independence for Cambodia. This pragmatic, even opportunistic, approach to Marxism would define his political career. While he adopted the language and symbols of Marxism-Leninism, his interpretation of the ideology was often idiosyncratic and heavily influenced by Cambodian cultural and historical contexts. Unlike the industrial proletariat that Marx envisioned as the driving force of revolution, Saloth Sar saw Cambodia's rural peasantry as the key to societal transformation. This focus on the agrarian population, shaped by his own rural upbringing, would later form the cornerstone of his revolutionary agenda. The influence of global independence movements. Saloth Sar's time in Paris coincided with the rise of anti-colonial movements across Asia and Africa. The Indian independence movement, led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, had achieved success in 1947, inspiring similar struggles elsewhere. In neighboring Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh were engaged in an armed struggle against French colonial forces, a conflict that would escalate into the First Indochina War. These movements served as powerful examples for Saloth Sar and his contemporaries. The Vietnamese struggle, in particular, had a direct impact on the political consciousness of Cambodian nationalists. The Viet Minh's success in mobilizing rural populations and waging guerrilla warfare demonstrated the potential for a small, determined group to challenge a colonial power. For Saloth Sar, it reinforced the idea that revolution was not only necessary but achievable. The decision to return home. By the early 1950s, Saloth Sar's focus had shifted entirely from his academic pursuits to his political activities. His time in Paris had radicalized him, providing both the ideological foundation and the practical networks he would later use to launch his revolutionary career. However, events in Cambodia were moving rapidly, and he felt an increasing pull to return home. In January 1953, King Norodom Sihanouk dissolved Cambodia's National Assembly and began ruling by decree. This move, coupled with the escalating First Indochina War in Vietnam, plunged Cambodia into political turmoil. The Marxist Circle in Paris decided to send one of its members back to Cambodia to assess the situation and determine how best to support the growing independence movement. Saloth Sar volunteered for the mission. In December 1952, after 3 years in Paris, Saloth Sar left the city that had so profoundly shaped his worldview and returned to Southeast Asia. His return marked the beginning of a new phase in his life, one in which he would move from intellectual exploration to direct political action. The seeds of revolution had been sown, and the man who would later be known as Pol Pot was beginning to emerge. Part 4, Cambodia's Road to Independence and Saloth Sar's Political Ascent. The early 1950s were a period of profound transformation for Cambodia. As Saloth Sar returned to his homeland in late 1952, the country was grappling with the dual pressures of colonial rule and an emerging nationalist fervor. France, weakened by the devastation of World War II and entangled in the First Indochina War with Vietnam, faced increasing challenges to its authority across its colonies. Cambodia, long a quiet corner of French Indochina, was beginning to stir with demands for independence. For Saloth Sar, these turbulent times provided fertile ground for political engagement and the opportunity to begin implementing the revolutionary ideas he had developed during his years in Paris. Cambodia in the early 1950s, a nation in flux, the geopolitical landscape of Southeast Asia in the early 1950s was marked by conflict and transformation. In neighboring Vietnam, the Viet Minh's war against French colonial forces had escalated into a full-scale struggle for independence. This conflict, known as the First Indochina War, reverberated throughout the region, inspiring nationalist movements in Laos and Cambodia. Cambodia's King Norodom Sihanouk, initially seen as a puppet of the French, began to assert himself more forcefully, seeking greater autonomy for his nation. In 1946, Cambodia had held its first elections for a national parliament, and in 1947, a new constitution was adopted. While these developments represented progress, they fell short of the full independence many Cambodians desired. By 1952, tensions between the French administration and Cambodian nationalists were reaching a breaking point. The colonial government's inability to quell insurgencies in Vietnam had weakened its authority, and the winds of change were sweeping through Indochina. For Saloth Sar, this period of political upheaval was both a challenge and an opportunity. His return to Cambodia coincided with a growing wave of discontent against French rule. Nationalist sentiment was on the rise, fueled by the successes of anti-colonial movements elsewhere in Asia and Africa. At the same time, Cambodia's domestic political landscape was becoming increasingly fragmented. The monarchy, long a symbol of stability, was losing its grip on power, and various political factions were vying for influence. Saloth Sar's initial political activities. Upon his return to Cambodia, Saloth Sar quickly immersed himself in the country's political currents. His experiences in Paris had equipped him with both the ideological framework and the organizational skills needed to navigate the complexities of Cambodian politics. he began networking with other like-minded individuals, many of whom had also been radicalized by their experiences abroad. Together, they sought to channel the growing discontent into a cohesive political movement. During this time, Saloth Sar initially aligned himself with the Democratic Party, a prominent anti-monarchy political group that had gained traction in the wake of Cambodia's first elections. The Democratic Party advocated for greater independence from France and sought to limit the powers of the monarchy. Saloth Sar and his fellow Marxist-Leninists saw the party as a potential vehicle for advancing their revolutionary goals. They began infiltrating the party's ranks, seeking to influence its direction from within. However, the political climate in Cambodia was becoming increasingly volatile. In January 1953, King Sihanouk dissolved the National Assembly and assumed full control of the government. This move, which he justified as a necessary step to achieve independence, effectively sidelined the Democratic Party and other opposition groups. Sihanouk's actions deepened the divisions within Cambodian politics, creating an environment of uncertainty and instability. The push for Cambodian independence, Sihanouk's decision to dissolve the National Assembly marked the beginning of a dramatic shift in Cambodia's trajectory. Determined to secure independence from France, the king launched a diplomatic campaign to gain international support for Cambodia's sovereignty. His efforts culminated in November 1953, when France, facing mounting pressure and unable to maintain its grip on Indochina, granted Cambodia full independence. While Sihanouk's actions were celebrated by many, they also generated significant opposition. His authoritarian approach to governance alienated key segments of the population, including the urban intelligentsia, rural peasants, and emerging political factions like the Marxist-Leninists. For Saloth Sar, the achievement of independence under Sihanouk's leadership was bittersweet. While the end of colonial rule was a significant milestone, the new government's consolidation of power left little room for alternative political voices. The rise of the Cambodian left. In the years following independence, Cambodia's political landscape continued to evolve. The newly sovereign nation faced numerous challenges, including economic underdevelopment, social inequality, and the lingering effects of colonial rule. These issues provided fertile ground for the growth of leftist ideologies, particularly among Cambodia's intellectual elite. In 1954, the Geneva Conference brought an end to the First Indochina War and formally recognized the independence of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. However, the conference also divided Vietnam into two states, the Communist North and the pro-Western South. This division had significant implications for Cambodia, which found itself caught between competing Cold War powers. The presence of North Vietnamese forces in Cambodian territory further complicated the situation, as it fueled tensions between the Cambodian government and leftist insurgents. Against this backdrop, Saloth Sar and his Marxist-Leninist allies began to organize more systematically. In 1959, they established the Kampuchean Labour Party, the precursor to the Khmer Rouge. This underground organization sought to unite Cambodia's fragmented leftist factions and build a revolutionary movement capable of challenging Sihanouk's regime. Saloth Sar, who had by now adopted the revolutionary pseudonym Pol Pot, emerged as a key figure within the party, known for his strategic thinking and ideological commitment. Sihanouk's repression and Pol Pot's political survival, Sihanouk, aware of the growing threat posed by leftist movements, responded with a campaign of repression. Political opponents were arrested, intimidated, or forced into exile. In 1957, senior members of the Democratic Party were subjected to public humiliation during a staged debate, effectively neutralizing the party as a political force. The monarchy's dominance seemed unassailable, and many leftists were driven underground. Pol Pot, however, managed to evade the regime's crackdown. By the early 1960s, he had retreated to the rural areas of Cambodia, where he began building a base of support among disaffected peasants. This period marked a turning point in his political career. Isolated from urban centers and the traditional political establishment, Pol Pot developed a deeper appreciation for the potential of Cambodia's rural population to serve as the foundation for a revolutionary movement. Part 5. The Path to Revolution. The 1960s marked a period of growing turmoil in Cambodia, setting the stage for the country's descent into revolution and civil war. Pol Pot, who had begun building his revolutionary network in rural Cambodia, rose to prominence within the Cambodian communist movement during this decade. The interplay of domestic political repression, growing Cold War tensions, and the escalating Vietnam War would shape the trajectory of both Pol Pot's rise and Cambodia's political destiny. Consolidation of the communist movement. By the early 1960s, Pol Pot and his allies in the Kampuchean Labour Party were gaining momentum, despite being driven underground by Prince Norodom Sihanak's increasingly authoritarian rule. In 1960, the party underwent a significant transformation, rebranding itself as the Workers' Party of Kampuchea, WPK. At a clandestine meeting in Phnom Penh's railway station, Pol Pot emerged as a key figure within the party's leadership. Though officially third in command, his influence grew rapidly as he proved adept at organizing and inspiring loyalty among his followers. The repressive measures of Sihanak's government played a crucial role in bolstering the communist movement. Political dissent was ruthlessly suppressed, with opposition figures arrested, tortured, or killed. Sihanak's regime, which initially enjoyed widespread support for achieving independence, had alienated many segments of Cambodian society by the 1960s. Intellectuals, students, and rural peasants alike began to see the monarchy as a symbol of corruption and collaboration with foreign powers. For Pol Pot, this discontent provided an opportunity to expand his influence and rally support for his revolutionary cause. The shift to the countryside. Recognizing the limited prospects for revolution in Cambodia's cities, Pol Pot and his followers turned their attention to the countryside. This strategic shift reflected both the unique conditions of Cambodian society and the broader ideological currents of the communist movement. Unlike industrialized nations where Marxist revolutionaries relied on the urban proletariat, Cambodia was an overwhelmingly agrarian society. The rural peasants, who made up the majority of the population, were seen as the key to revolutionary success. Pol Pot's time in the countryside was transformative. Living among the peasants, he gained first-hand insight into their grievances and hardships. Decades of colonial exploitation, combined with the inequalities perpetuated by the monarchy, had left many rural Cambodians impoverished and resentful. Pol Pot's rhetoric, which emphasized agrarian reform and the empowerment of the peasantry, resonated deeply with this population. Under his leadership, the WPK began to establish a network of support in Cambodia's remote northern and eastern regions. This period also marked the beginning of Pol Pot's embrace of an ideology that would later define his regime. A vision of radical agrarian socialism that sought to eliminate all vestiges of urban, intellectual, and bourgeois influence. Drawing inspiration from China's Great Leap Forward, Pol Pot envisioned a society where agriculture would serve as the foundation for economic and social transformation. However, his interpretation of communist ideology was deeply influenced by Cambodia's unique history and culture. Rather than adhering strictly to Marxist-Leninist doctrine, Pol Pot crafted a distinctly Cambodian version of revolutionary socialism. The Khmer Rouge emerges. In 1966, the Workers' Party of Kampuchea underwent another rebranding, becoming the Communist Party of Kampuchea, CPK. Around the same time, Sihanak began referring to the party's members as the Khmer Rouge, or Red Cambodians. Though initially rejected by the party itself, the term would become synonymous with Pol Pot's movement and its brutal legacy. During this period, the Khmer Rouge began to distance itself from the North Vietnamese communists, who had provided support to Cambodian leftists in earlier years. Pol Pot and his allies sought to establish an independent Cambodian revolutionary movement, one that would not be subordinated to the interests of Vietnam. This break with the Vietnamese communists reflected not only ideological differences but also historical tensions between the two nations. Pol Pot's vision for Cambodia was rooted in a fierce nationalism that sought to preserve the country's sovereignty at all costs. The Khmer Rouge also began to refine its military capabilities during the mid-1960s. Armed insurgents were trained in the jungles of northern and eastern Cambodia, preparing for the eventual confrontation with Sihanouk's government. By 1967, the movement had several thousand armed members, and its leaders believed the time was ripe for action. In January 1968, the Khmer Rouge launched its first major offensive, attacking an army base at Bay Damran near Battambang in northwest Cambodia. This marked the beginning of the Cambodian Civil War, a conflict that would engulf the country for the next 8 years. Cambodia in the shadow of the Vietnam War. The Cambodian Civil War unfolded against the backdrop of the escalating Vietnam War, which profoundly influenced the course of events in Cambodia. By the late 1960s, the United States was deeply involved in Vietnam, backing the South Vietnamese government against the Communist North. Cambodia, which shared a porous border with Vietnam, became a key battleground in the wider conflict. North Vietnamese forces, including the Viet Cong, used Cambodian territory as a base for operations against South Vietnam. This brought Cambodia into the crosshairs of the US military, which launched a series of bombing campaigns in northeastern Cambodia to disrupt Viet Cong supply lines. These bombings caused widespread destruction and displaced hundreds of thousands of rural Cambodians, many of whom became sympathetic to the Khmer Rouge as a result. The Vietnam War also exacerbated political tensions within Cambodia. In 1970, a coup d'etat overthrew Sihanouk's government, replacing it with a pro-American regime led by General Lon Nol. The new government, known as the Khmer Republic, sought to align Cambodia with the United States and expel the Viet Cong from Cambodian territory. However, Lon Nol's regime was deeply unpopular, and its efforts to suppress communist insurgents were often heavy-handed and ineffective. Pol Pot's rise to leadership. The events of 1970 marked a turning point for Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. The overthrow of Sihanouk, who retained significant popular support despite his authoritarian rule, provided an unexpected boost to the communist movement. Sihanouk, now in exile in China, forged an alliance with the Khmer Rouge, urging his supporters to join forces with the communists to overthrow Lon Nol's government. This bizarre alliance between the deposed monarch and the revolutionary communists helped swell the ranks of the Khmer Rouge. Thousands of pro-Sihanouk rebels joined the movement, bringing its total strength to nearly 50,000 fighters by 1972. Pol Pot, who had by this time become the undisputed leader of the Khmer Rouge, began to consolidate his control over the movement. Under his leadership, the Khmer Rouge adopted a more centralized and disciplined structure, with clear lines of authority and a focus on preparing for a decisive confrontation with the Khmer Republic. The civil war intensifies. As the Khmer Rouge expanded its military and political influence, the Cambodian Civil War escalated. By the early 1970s, the Khmer Rouge controlled significant portions of Cambodia's northern and eastern regions. The Lon Nol government, meanwhile, struggled to maintain its grip on power, relying heavily on US military aid to sustain its forces. In 1973, the United States launched a massive bombing campaign in Cambodia, targeting Khmer Rouge strongholds and Viet Cong bases. While the bombings temporarily halted the Khmer Rouge advance, they also caused widespread devastation and alienated many rural Cambodians. By 1975, the Khmer Rouge had surrounded Phnom Penh, the capital city. On April 17, 1975, the city fell to Pol Pot's forces, marking the end of the civil war and the beginning of a new and horrific chapter in Cambodia's history. Part 6: The Seizure of Power and the Rise of Democratic Kampuchea. On April 17, 1975, Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge forces marched triumphantly into Phnom Penh, signaling the end of the Cambodian Civil War. The capital, already devastated by years of conflict, was now at the mercy of a revolutionary regime that would plunge the country into one of the darkest chapters in modern history. For many Cambodians, the Khmer Rouge victory initially represented hope, the promise of peace, stability, and a new beginning after years of bloodshed. However, the events that followed would reveal the true extent of Pol Pot's radical vision for Cambodia. The evacuation of Phnom Penh, the Khmer Rouge wasted no time in implementing their revolutionary agenda. Within hours of seizing Phnom Penh, Pol Pot's forces began one of the most shocking acts in modern history, the mass evacuation of the city's 2 million inhabitants. Under the pretext of protecting the population from impending American airstrikes, Khmer Rouge soldiers ordered everyone, men, women, children, the elderly, and the infirm, to leave the city immediately. The evacuation was brutal and chaotic. Hospitals were emptied, with patients wheeled out on stretchers or left to die. Families were forced to abandon their homes, possessions, and livelihoods, taking only what they could carry. Those who resisted or questioned the orders were executed on the spot. Within days, Phnom Penh was transformed into a ghost town, its streets eerily silent and deserted. Similar evacuations were carried out in other cities, as the Khmer Rouge sought to dismantle urban life across the country. Pol Pot and his regime viewed cities as symbols of corruption and decadence, remnants of colonialism and capitalism that had no place in their vision of a pure agrarian society. By forcing millions of Cambodians into the countryside, the Khmer Rouge aimed to create a self-sufficient, classless society rooted in communal farming. This radical experiment, which Pol Pot described as Year Zero, sought to erase Cambodia's history and start anew. The establishment of democratic Kampuchea. In January 1976, Pol Pot officially declared the establishment of democratic Kampuchea, a new regime governed by the Communist Party of Kampuchea, CPK. The country's institutions, culture, and traditions were systematically dismantled. Religion, education, and even family ties were deemed counter-revolutionary and targeted for destruction. The monarchy, long a symbol of Cambodian identity, was abolished. King Norodom Sihanouk, who had briefly served as a figurehead for the regime, was placed under house arrest. Pol Pot, now known as Brother Number One, wielded absolute power. The Khmer Rouge leadership, referred to collectively as the Chanka, the organization, ruled with an iron grip. The regime's policies were guided by an extreme version of agrarian socialism, which sought to transform Cambodia into a rural utopia. Currency was abolished, private property was confiscated, and all citizens were forced into communal labor camps. These camps, often little more than makeshift villages in the jungle, became the epicenter of Pol Pot's social experiment. The killing fields, Cambodia's descent into genocide, the Khmer Rouge vision for democratic Kampuchea was built on a foundation of violence and repression. Anyone perceived as a threat to the regime's authority, intellectuals, professionals, religious leaders, ethnic minorities, or even those who wore glasses, was labeled an enemy of the state. Pol Pot's paranoia and obsession with purity led to widespread purges, mass executions, and forced labor that would result in the deaths of an estimated 1.7 to 2.2 million Cambodians, nearly a quarter of the population. The killing fields, as they came to be known, were sites of unimaginable horror. Thousands of mass graves were scattered across the countryside, filled with the bodies of men, women, and children who had been executed with horrifying efficiency. To save ammunition, victims were often killed with crude tools like bamboo sticks, hammers, or machetes. Some were forced to dig their own graves before being executed. The Khmer Rouge atrocities were not limited to physical violence. Psychological torment, starvation, and forced separations further deepened the suffering of the Cambodian people. The notorious S-21 prison, also known as Chul Sleng, became a symbol of the regime's brutality. Originally a high school in Phnom Penh, it was converted into a torture and execution center where thousands of suspected enemies of the state were interrogated and killed. Of the approximately 20,000 people who passed through S-21, fewer than a dozen survived. The meticulous records kept by the Khmer Rouge, including photographs of prisoners and confessions extracted under torture, offer a chilling glimpse into the scale of their crimes. Ideological foundations of the genocide. The Khmer Rouge's policies were rooted in an extreme interpretation of Marxist-Leninist ideology, combined with Pol Pot's own vision of a uniquely Cambodian revolution. Unlike traditional Marxism, which emphasized the role of the industrial proletariat, Pol Pot's ideology centered on the rural peasantry. He believed that Cambodia's agrarian society could leap directly into communism, bypassing the stages of industrialization and urbanization that Marx had outlined. However, Pol Pot's vision was also shaped by a deep-seated nationalism and xenophobia. Ethnic minorities, including Vietnamese, Chinese, Cham Muslims, and ethnic Thai, were targeted for extermination. Religious practices, particularly Buddhism, were suppressed, with temples destroyed and monks executed or forced to renounce their faith. The regime's obsession with purity extended to its own ranks, as internal purges eliminated anyone suspected of harboring dissent or disloyalty. The collapse of democratic Kampuchea. By 1978, the Khmer Rouge's policies had plunged Cambodia into chaos. Agricultural production, far from achieving the promised utopia, collapsed under the strain of forced collectivization and mismanagement. Famine became widespread, with thousands dying of starvation and disease. The regime's increasingly paranoid and erratic behavior alienated even its former allies, including China, which had provided significant support in the early years. The final blow came in December 1978, when Vietnam launched a full-scale invasion of Cambodia. Years of border skirmishes and Khmer Rouge attacks on Vietnamese villages had strained relations between the two communist neighbors. The Vietnamese forces, numbering over 150,000, swiftly overran the Khmer Rouge defenses. On January 7, 1979, Phnom Penh fell to the Vietnamese, and the Khmer Rouge regime was overthrown. Pol Pot's flight and the aftermath. As the Vietnamese established a new government in Phnom Penh, Pol Pot and the remnants of the Khmer Rouge fled into the jungles along the Thai border. From this remote base, they waged a guerrilla insurgency against the Vietnamese-backed regime for more than a decade. Despite their horrific crimes, the Khmer Rouge continued to receive support from international powers, including China and the United States, due to Cold War geopolitics. Pol Pot's grip on power gradually weakened as internal divisions and military defeats took their toll. By the mid-1990s, the Khmer Rouge was a shadow of its former self. In 1997, Pol Pot was placed under house arrest by his own comrades, signaling the final collapse of his leadership. He died on April 15, 1998, in a remote jungle camp, reportedly of a heart attack, though some speculate he may have been poisoned or committed suicide to avoid prosecution. Part 7. The aftermath of Pol Pot's regime and the legacy of the Khmer Rouge. The fall of Phnom Penh to Vietnamese forces in January 1979 marked the end of Pol Pot's rule, but the aftermath of his regime left Cambodia scarred for generations. The horrors of democratic Kampuchea were not only a tragedy for Cambodia but also a stark reminder of the destructive potential of unchecked power, ideological extremism, and international indifference. Even as Pol Pot retreated into the jungles, the shadow of his actions loomed over Cambodia and the global community. The People's Republic of Kampuchea. Following the overthrow of the Khmer Rouge, Vietnam installed a new government in Phnom Penh, led by Cambodian defectors who had fled the purges of Pol Pot's regime. This new administration, known as the People's Republic of Kampuchea, PRK, was nominally independent but heavily reliant on Vietnamese support. The PRK sought to rebuild Cambodia from the ruins left by the Khmer Rouge, but the task was monumental. The country's infrastructure was in shambles, its economy had collapsed, and its population had been decimated by genocide, famine, and war. the PRK faced significant challenges, including the ongoing insurgency by Khmer Rouge forces, which had regrouped along the Thai border. Despite their defeat, the Khmer Rouge maintained a presence in rural Cambodia and continued to launch attacks on government forces. Meanwhile, the international community's response to Cambodia's plight was complicated by Cold War dynamics. The United States and its allies, eager to counter Vietnamese and Soviet influence in Southeast Asia, continued to recognize the Khmer Rouge as Cambodia's legitimate government in the United Nations, a decision that drew widespread criticism. Pol Pot's guerrilla campaign. From their jungle strongholds, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge waged a guerrilla war against the Vietnamese-backed government throughout the 1980s. Although the movement's strength had been severely diminished, it still posed a significant threat. Pol Pot attempted to rebrand the Khmer Rouge as a nationalist resistance movement, downplaying its communist roots and atrocities to garner international support. The regime even received covert assistance from some Western powers, who viewed the Khmer Rouge as a counterbalance to Vietnamese influence. Despite these efforts, Pol Pot's influence within the movement began to wane. Internal divisions and military setbacks weakened the Khmer Rouge, and by the mid-1990s, it was clear that the movement was in terminal decline. In 1997, Pol Pot was overthrown in a coup by his own comrades and placed under house arrest. His former allies, including the notorious Commander Tar Mok, sought to distance themselves from his leadership as they struggled to maintain their relevance in Cambodia's changing political landscape. Pol Pot's death and the end of the Khmer Rouge. Pol Pot died on April 15, 1998, under mysterious circumstances. Official reports stated that he succumbed to a heart attack, but rumors persisted that he had been poisoned or taken his own life to avoid capture and prosecution. His death marked the symbolic end of the Khmer Rouge, which had already disintegrated into scattered factions by that time. The remaining leaders of the movement were gradually captured or surrendered in the years that followed, and in 1999, the last remnants of the Khmer Rouge formally disbanded. Cambodia's struggle for justice. The fall of the Khmer Rouge did not immediately bring justice or closure to the Cambodian people. For decades, the perpetrators of the genocide evaded accountability, protected by political alliances and the complexities of international diplomacy. It was not until 2003 that the Cambodian government, in collaboration with the United Nations, established the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia, ECCC, to prosecute those responsible for the Khmer Rouge crimes. The ECCC, commonly known as the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, faced numerous challenges, including limited funding, political interference, and the advanced age of many defendants. Nevertheless, it achieved several landmark convictions. In 2010, Kaing Gek Eve, also known as Dutch, the commander of the infamous S-21 prison, was convicted of crimes against humanity and sentenced to life imprisonment. In 2014, two senior Khmer Rouge leaders, Nuon Chia and Khieu Samphan, were found guilty of genocide and other crimes. Despite these convictions, the tribunal's work has been criticized for its slow pace and limited scope. Many lower-ranking Khmer Rouge officials were never brought to justice, and Pol Pot himself, the architect of the regime's atrocities, escaped trial. For many Cambodians, the legacy of the Khmer Rouge remains a painful and unresolved chapter in their history. The legacy of the Khmer Rouge era left an indelible mark on Cambodia, reshaping its society, politics, and culture. The genocide decimated the country's population, killing nearly a quarter of its citizens and creating a profound demographic imbalance. Entire families were wiped out and survivors were left to grapple with trauma and loss. The Khmer Rouge's destruction of institutions, from schools to religious sites, left a vacuum that took decades to rebuild. Economically, Cambodia was set back by decades. The forced collectivization of agriculture and the dismantling of industry left the country impoverished and dependent on foreign aid. Even today, Cambodia continues to face the long-term consequences of the Khmer Rouge policies, including widespread poverty, underdevelopment, and a fragile political system. Politically, the Khmer Rouge legacy has shaped Cambodia's modern governance. The Vietnamese-backed PRK laid the foundation for the current government, led by Hun Sen, a former Khmer Rouge officer who defected to the Vietnamese side. Critics argue that Hun Sen's long rule, marked by authoritarianism and corruption, reflects the lingering influence of the Khmer Rouge political culture. International lessons from the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge genocide remains one of the most devastating atrocities of the 20th century, comparable to the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, and the Armenian genocide. It serves as a grim reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, ideological extremism, and the dehumanization of perceived enemies. The international community's failure to intervene during the Khmer Rouge reign, and its continued recognition of the regime in the years that followed, highlight the ethical and political challenges of responding to atrocities. Pol Pot's regime also underscores the importance of historical memory and education. Efforts to document the crimes of the Khmer Rouge, from survivor testimonies to the preservation of sites like Chul Sleng and the Killing Fields, have been essential in ensuring that the lessons of this dark period are not forgotten. Conclusion: the shadow of Pol Pot. Pol Pot's name is now synonymous with cruelty, genocide, and the destruction of a nation. Born Saloth Sar in a small Cambodian village, he rose to power as a revolutionary leader, driven by a vision of a radically restructured society. Yet his utopian dream turned into a nightmare for millions of Cambodians, as his regime unleashed unprecedented suffering in its pursuit of ideological purity. Even after his death, Pol Pot's legacy continues to haunt Cambodia and the world. His actions serve as a stark warning of the perils of extremism and the devastating consequences of unchecked authoritarian rule. While Cambodia has made strides in rebuilding and healing, the scars of the Khmer Rouge era remain a poignant reminder of the resilience of its people and the enduring importance of justice, accountability, and remembrance.